Hi, and welcome to another prayer meeting with Cottondale. It's a privilege to be with you this evening. 2021 is almost upon us, and so I pray God's blessing over you this new year. Maybe you have some New Year's resolutions, I don't know, but it is always a great time to reflect on how your life is going. And are there any habits or practices in your life that you could cultivate or that you could take out that might improve your heart and your mind for the Lord, and habits that you might could cultivate, Lord, to grow in your knowledge and love and obedience to Him? One of those habits is regular time reading and studying His Word, regular time in worship with fellow believers, regular time in prayer, regular time in spiritual conversation, and regular time in service to others. And so those are some things you can think about this year, and ask the Lord, God, what do you want me to do? What can I do this year, Lord, to fulfill your purposes that you have entrusted to me? So just something to think about as we move into the new year. But we're going to pick back up in the book of Daniel this evening, another great and very famous story from the book of Daniel that I think we can learn a lot from. And this time it's in Daniel chapter 6. And so, as usual, you can hit the pause button and read through the entirety of Daniel chapter 6. If you're with someone, you might want to read it out loud and work all the way through it. And when you're done, we'll dive in. So go ahead and hit the pause button and pick back up with me when you're done. Okay, so we're just going to kind of walk through it in three parts here, like we normally do. We're going to begin in verse 1 tonight. It says, "It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps to be a satrap or whatever would be just like a high-level government official, okay, to be throughout the whole kingdom, and over them 3 officials, of whom Daniel was one, to whom these satraps should give account, so that the king might suffer no loss. Then this Daniel became distinguished above all the other high officials and satraps, because an excellent spirit was in him, and the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. Then the high officials and the satraps sought to find a ground for complaint against Daniel with regard to the kingdom, but they could find no ground for complaint or any fault, because he was faithful, and no error or fault was found in him. Then these men said, 'We shall not find any ground for complaint against this Daniel, unless we find it in connection with the law of his God.'" Well, let's jump back here to the beginning. So this is now Babylon has been taken over by the Medes and the Persians. This is King Darius. He is setting 120 officials over his kingdom, and over those officials he's setting 3 high officials, of whom Daniel was one. So Daniel already possesses one of the highest ranks within the Persian government here. Okay, and Daniel became distinguished as he had pretty much his whole life, right, with Nebuchadnezzar and then all the other kings, right? Because an excellent spirit was in him, and so we see that the totality of Daniel's life is just characterized by this great faithfulness, this great wisdom that was evident to every king that he worked for. And so Daniel wasn't in the position that he was by fluke. It was because God had given wisdom to him that was evident to all who saw it. And so that's something worth praying for right there, isn't it? That God would make us wise and faithful people to the point that it'd be evident, right? And that we might have this excellent spirit of Daniel to be able to discern. And remember, Daniel, this is Daniel is in what we might call a secular vocation. There's really no such thing as secular, right? This is God's world. Everything belongs to God, and we're supposed to eat and drink to the glory of God. How much more work for the glory of God? So Daniel is a in one sense could think of him as a politician, right? He's a high-level government official within the kingdom of Babylon, and yet he's doing his work of serving the people of of Persia, whatever, with great wisdom, right? And so he was a government official to the glory of God, with great wisdom from God to do what? To execute government, to execute wise government. And so all those things are themselves gifts from God. And whatever we do, whether it's eat, drink, or work in the government, or make coffee, or whatever we do it to the glory of God with the wisdom that God provides. And when we do that, when we work not as for man, but as if we're working for the Lord, this happens. People take notice. And then apparently these other people, we could probably assume out of jealousy, right? These other officials didn't like the fact that Daniel had gotten so much more favor than they had with the king. And so they looked for a ground of complaint against him. But isn't this incredible right here? They could find no ground for complaint or any fault because he was faithful, and no error or fault was found in him. I mean, it's kind of condemning, isn't it? I mean, that's amazing, right? They could take an honest look at his life and find it's not saying here that Daniel was perfect, but it is saying that with regards to what he did, he was faithful, right? He was consistent, right? There was no glaringly obvious, glaringly wrong thing that he was doing. He was executing everything with wisdom and intentionality and integrity, right? And so when that happened, there was no ground for complaint. and then so it kind of begs the question about us, doesn't it? About the ground of complaint. What could be found against us? Are we faithful like Daniel? Well, then he goes on to say, we shall not find any ground for complaint against Daniel unless we find it in connection with the law of his God. And so now this is remarkable here. Not only was did Daniel execute his work as a government official with such wisdom and integrity and consistency, and that there was no way they could accuse him on that ground based off of his work performance, if you will. So good was so profound was his integrity and his consistency, his faithfulness, as it's put here, that they recognized, and that the only way that they could level a complaint against him was if it was in connection with his worship of God. Right? Isn't that astounding? They looked, and so of course that meant that Daniel's faith was very public, even in what he did. Right? This isn't modern day America where you kind of keep your faith to yourself like they tell us to. You keep that separate. But that's not how it works. The other officials within Daniel's sphere of influence knew who he worshipped. In fact, they knew his faith in God, in fact, was so evident in the work that he did that they realized that if they were going to level any complaint against him, it would have to be in connection with God. And what a testimony, right? What would it be like if people examined our lives and the only thing that they could complain about in our life is that we were too faithful to God, that we loved God too much, that we would serve God even at the cost, that we would serve God at any point, even if it conflicted with another authority in our life, say the king in Daniel's case, right? They knew that he was so faithful to God that they knew that the only way they could get him is if they put the king in conflict with Daniel's God, and so that's the only way they could get him. And so it's astounding. So let's ask, if others examined our lives to find a point of unfaithfulness, what would it be? I imagine most of us could think of at least one thing, right, where we are not quite faithful as we need to be in. Well, what then, by God's grace, can you do about it, right? We are who we are by the grace of God. If you're a believer in Jesus Christ here, this evening, you're watching this, it's not that you have to obey God, it's that you want to obey God. You love God. And so what we're asking here is, and there's always a point where we could be more faithful, and so what we're asking tonight is, what's one of those points? And what can I do about it? What can I do so that my life is more like Christ tomorrow than it is today? Is more like Daniel than it is today, okay? Pray and ask for help, and that God would ultimately become, and then next to that, pray that God would help us become such a person that if a fault could be found, it would be the fault of being too devoted to God. That just always, it's incredible, right? What a testimony, and what a witness, and what a glorious goal to strive for in our lives, that if anyone would look in our lives to find a fault, if we have any fault, let that fault be we are too devoted to God, if that's possible. It's not, but humanly speaking, that would be the only fault that we had, is that we take God too seriously. Some people, I feel like, in kind of shy away from Christianity or from being overly religious. They feel like it has a bad connotation. I don't want to be overly religious. I don't want to be, people who take God too seriously. But I'm not sure that we can take God too seriously. We can take ourselves too seriously, but we can never take God too seriously. So why not pray that God would help us become such a person that if a fault could be found, it would be this, that he or she loves God too much. And then pray the same for our church, for the church abroad, but also for our local church, that God would make us this kind of people. Take some time, pray through these things, and jump back with me when you're done. Okay, we're going to move straight on to verse 6 here. It says, Then these high officials and satraps came by agreement to the king and said to him, O King Darius, live forever. All these high officials of the kingdom, the prefects and the satraps, the counselors and the governors, are agreed that the king should establish an ordinance and enforce an injunction, that whoever makes a petition to any god or man for 30 days, except to you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions. What is that? They're appealing to his pride, isn't there? Oh, make this temporary decree for these 30 days to honor you, O king, that if anyone makes any position, let it be to you, because everyone depends on you, right? Everybody needs you. What is that? Well, it's an appeal to Darius's pride. And Darius isn't, his love for Daniel shows that he isn't this terrible guy, but flattery can be very deceptive and very appealing, right? Even to otherwise, humble people, right? Flattery can be very deceitful and deceptive and tricky. And so, and that's what they appeal to, is flattery. Okay, and he says, Now, O king, establish the injunction and sign the document so that it cannot be changed according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be revoked. Therefore, King Darius signed the document and the injunction. Now get this. When Daniel knew that the document had been signed, he went to his house, where he had windows in his upper chamber open towards Jerusalem. He got down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as he had done previously. Okay. So again, they're appealing to his pride, Darius's pride, and they've all come together in this agreement. They've all come together in this scheme. All right, and they they're working the political system, right? That still happens today, doesn't it? They're working the political system to twist it in their favor because one of the laws here of the Medes and the Persians is that once a law is made, it cannot be changed. So I don't know if that's the best policy. It's probably not, because that kind of assumes that you're always right when you make a law. It's not really a great policy, but that was the policy, right? When a law was made, it couldn't be changed. Darius had, and so they knew that if they could get Darius to make this law, right, his hands would be tied. He could not immediately turn back and revoke what he had just signed into law. And so they were playing Darius and playing the system. Okay? But what really stands out here is that when Daniel knew that the document had been signed, he went to his house. He got down on his knees and prayed and gave thanks to God as he had done before. So it's this phrase right here that really stands out to me at this moment. Daniel, when he did this, it wasn't in ignorance, right? Daniel didn't go pray in ignorance. He went to pray after he knew that the document had already been signed. And so the point is that Daniel made a calculated decision, knowing that the consequences of that decision would be, as far from a sheer human perspective, his death, right? He knew that part of the signed document was that whoever disobeyed would be thrown into the den of lions, right? So just think about that for a second, right? Daniel consciously made a decision knowing that decision would cost him his life. Okay? Just think about that. A conscious decision to worship God knowing that decision would cost him his life. Okay? And notice that this too, notice that the decision that Daniel made wasn't some grand gesture. Okay? The decision, we, humanly speaking, I think, God help us, right? We would say, oh, well, it's just prayer, so I can just pray with my eyes open and nobody would know, and everything will be fine, right? We would excuse it away. But Daniel refused to do that. He refused to make it look like he was stopping worshiping God. And so he was willing to go to his death so that he could pray. So I just think that we have to reflect on that, and that we should reflect on it enough so that it begins to reorient the way we think about our lives. Would we be willing to go to our death so that we could pray to God? Would we be willing to, do we so value our worship of God that we would risk our very lives to make sure that we continue to do that? So I just think we have to think about it and reflect about it and ask ourselves, do I have the faith? Do I have the love of God, the moral courage to worship God even when it's going to cost me, knowing that it's going to cost me? And I just think this is a question that every Christian has to deal with, and it's something that we need to take seriously, because I believe that within my lifetime, Christians will face a great deal more opposition right here in the United States of America than we ever have before, and that we will have to make decisions that are common in other parts of the world. God help our brothers and sisters, but in one sense, but hasn't been common here, and so it's probably made us as American Christians out of touch with reality. But the time is coming, and we're going to have to decide whether we're going to be willing, like brothers and sisters in other parts of the world, to worship God even when it costs us. And so that's something to think about, and it's something to pray about, both for ourselves and for the upcoming generations of Christians here in the United States and really around the world, because the truth is persecution is ramping up all around the world. And so, prayer point, pray for the moral courage to obey and follow Christ even at great personal cost. It's moral courage. It's courage to do the right thing when it would, even to do the right thing when it costs you greatly, when it would be very easy to just yield, right? It would have been very easy for Daniel to say, well, I'm just going to go hide in a closet and pray somewhere, and no one will ever know, and it'll be fine. But the problem is they already knew his practices, and if he did that, then it would be essentially him telling them that he's more afraid of the king than he is of God. And so he had a decision to make. But that took moral courage to make that decision, something that I'm afraid that we just frankly lack, to do the right thing even when it's hard. And so we need help. We need God's help to have the moral courage to obey and follow Christ even at great personal cost. Likewise, as I mentioned, pray for the upcoming generation who will likely face greater challenges than we've known in the previous 100 years in the United States of America. Okay, for a long time, the Christianity was, in America at least, was not even just tolerated, it was acceptable, beneficial, societally beneficial, which in some ways hurt the church because you had people claiming to be Christians who really weren't. But but America's not the way that it used to be, for better or for worse. There's good and there's bad. The bad is it's going to be harder for Christians. The good is we're no longer going to have people who claim to be Christian just because it's societally acceptable. The only people who are going to be Christians in the coming decades are people who really believe it. And so that's a good thing. But it's going to take courage for the church. And so pray for faith, courage, conviction, joy, hope, and love. So when I say these things, I don't intend to incite fear or a sense of foreboding or hopelessness. The Bible very clearly says that people who truly follow Christ will suffer for it. That's not a secret. Okay? But the glory of Christianity is that we can endure suffering with joy, hope, and love, right? We don't have to live because our hope's not in the world. So if they take away the earthly privileges and freedoms, so be it, because our hope's not in the world. So we're not going to give into despair or bitterness or resentment because they take those things away, because those things were never our hope to begin with. And it's joy and hope and love in the midst of suffering for Christ's name that will actually show the world that our hope is not in the world. And so that, in effect, is our time as Christians to shine, if you will, our time to shine. And so let's pray for courage and conviction that is full of joy, hope, and love in the midst of whatever suffering that Christ may call us to. So why not take some time and kind of pray through these things? I will clear this out for you so you can see it and lift these requests up to God and pick back up with me when you're done. Okay, so we're going to finish up here with some verses from the end of the chapter. It says, "Then Daniel said to the king, 'O king, live forever.'" So this is when the king had come back the following morning after putting Daniel in the lion's den. Okay, and he goes in and he's hoping to find Daniel alive. He asks if Daniel's God has saved him, and then he hears Daniel's voice calling back to him. Then Daniel said to the king, "O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they have not harmed me, because I was found blameless before him. And also before you, O king, I've done no harm. Then the king was exceedingly glad and commanded that Daniel be taken up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no kind of harm was found on him, because he had trusted in his God. Then King Darius wrote to all the peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth, peace be multiplied to you. I make a decree that in all my royal dominion people are to tremble and fear before the God of Daniel, for he is the living God, enduring forever. His kingdom shall never be destroyed, and his dominion shall be to the end. He delivers and rescues. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. He who has saved Daniel from the power of the lions. Okay. So, when Darius came back to the den of lions, he was anxious and concerned. But when he called out to Daniel, Daniel called out back to him. God had sent his angel to shut the lions' mouths because he was found blameless before him. And so what this is a testimony to God's faithfulness and deliverance. And that's not to say that God will always deliver us in situations like this. We know that's not the case. And the Bible nowhere promises that will be the case. We can remember back to the stories of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, right? They refused to bow down to the giant image. But they told Nebuchadnezzar, they said, God is able to save us, but even if he doesn't, we won't bow down or worship the golden statue. And so in the same way, God's never obligated to deliver us, but because ultimately our deliverance is not in this life, but is in the life to come, the forgiveness of sins and the resurrection of the dead. That is our ultimate deliverance. So whether we're delivered humanly speaking or not, we're always ultimately delivered. But God in this case did deliver Daniel in a supernatural, miraculous way, and it was because he was found blameless before him. And so that simply is to say that Daniel trusted him and lived a life characterized by faith and obedience to him, something that we can all do by the power of the Holy Spirit. We're not perfect, but we can live a life of what the Bible refers to as blamelessness, which is just a life characterized by general faithfulness to God with a clean conscience, having no awareness of, doesn't mean we're perfect, but we, as far as our conscience is concerned, we know of no deliberate disobedience in our heart and in our lives. And he was found blameless before God, and God delivered him. And you, no doubt, if you've walked with God for any length of time, can think of a situation where you thought, man, I don't know how this is going to work out. And God delivered you, right? And if he could deliver you then, and if he can deliver Daniel from a den of lions, then God can do whatever he wants, whenever he wants to, right? But whether he delivers us in the way we expect or not, our job is to be blameless and faithful before God, right? And the king was glad, and Daniel was taken up, and it says, and no kind of harm was found on him because he had trusted in his God. There it is. That's the key, right? That's the key that becomes even more clear in the New Testament, is that the root of Daniel's blamelessness, this is it parallels. No harm was found in him, it says there, and it's paralleled with this one. He was not harmed because he was blameless, right? Not harmed because he was blameless, but down here it says no harm because he trusted. And so so those two go together, right? And so it's the trust that rooted his blamelessness. He was blameless before God because he trusted him and therefore wanted to obey him and be faithful to him. And because he trusted in his God, God delivered him. When we trust in God, God will help us. God will deliver us. Sometimes in supernatural, miraculous ways. Sometimes, and sometimes his deliverance comes through death in the hope of the resurrection of the dead. Regardless, if we're found faithful to him, if we trust him, God will always deliver us. And what's interesting is that it's very similar to back with Nebuchadnezzar, okay, when God had done a miraculous work in the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, right? In a very similar way, King Darius, when he sees the deliverance of Daniel from the lion's den here, he writes a letter to his entire kingdom, right? And does what? He makes a royal decree that the people are to tremble and fear Daniel's God. And so notice that God's salvation of Daniel, God's deliverance of Daniel, led to Darius saying that we should tremble and fear before Daniel. Because the God who can shut the mouths of lions is a God to be concerned about, right? A God to be reckoned with, a God to be accounted for, right? He is the living God. And notice that this connection, it's the same connection that's a theme throughout the whole book of Daniel, so that's part of the reason why it's here. But it's also the same thing that Nebuchadnezzar said, and that he connects God's saving power with God's kingdom. And that's an interesting connection there, but there it is. He connects God's saving power with God's kingdom, and not just that, but the eternality of God's kingdom. Since God is able to shut the mouths of lions, then he's the ultimately one in charge, because even the greatest king in the world can't do that. Okay? And so because of that, God is the true king above all earthly kings, and he has a kingdom that nobody can thwart, that nothing can stop. And this is again probably the major theme of the book of Daniel, is the enduring nature of the kingdom of God. He rules over the nations of men. He accomplishes his purpose, and no one can thwart him or say to him, "What are you doing?" Right? God is the king. Okay, so as we reflect on this, why not just reflect, how has God delivered you in the past? I'm sure some things come to mind. Why not just take some time in thankful remembrance and give him some praise tonight for how he's helped you in the past. And then pray that as we remain faithful to Christ, others would see and give glory to him that is due. When we trust in God, God acts. And when God acts, people, even non-believers, as far as we can see here, will give God glory. And that's what we want. We want to live lives of such faithfulness to Christ that when we trust him, he will act on our behalf and get the glory that he deserves. And so as we finish out, pray through these things and pick back up with me when you're done. All right, I thank you so much for joining us this evening as we pray together and walk through the book of Daniel. I hope it's been a blessing to you. I hope you have a great rest of the week. I hope you have a happy New Year, and I hope you will worship with us this Sunday at 9:30 a.m. In person, or if you can't do that, online. As we worship with us as we worship the King, whose kingdom has no end and which endures forever. If there's anything we can do for you, please let us know. Anything we can be praying for you about, please let us know. I hope you have a great week. God bless you.